afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 27th of June. I'll start the programme as usual with the most recent up-to-date statistics for coronavirus. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, 2,836 newly confirmed cases of COVID were registered in the previous 24 hours. 3 new reported deaths of people who had tested positive. There have been 3,730,101 people in Scotland who have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and a further 2,666,827 have received the second dose. At weekends, only statistics on new cases, deaths and vaccinations are updated. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 268,293 people in Scotland have tested positive, and sadly, of those who have tested positive, 7,711 have died. I'm joined today from Edinburgh by actor and writer Julie Coombe, and from Dundee, activist and disability campaigner Siobhan Tolland. Good afternoon to you both. I hope you're both well. We're going to start today with one of the big stories from Westminster, and that is Matt Hancock. He's gone. He has his peg has come off, his coat has come off that shrinkly peg, he's fallen on his sword, and off he has gone. Siobhan, I'm just wondering, is it just me, or has his broken social distancing rules become the new euphemism for having an affair? I mean, it sounds a bit like carry on up the cabinet, because surely the important thing is he's had an affair, not that, and one would assume if he's any good at sex, then he has had to obviously break social distancing. And the photographs and the videos of him with much ass grasping would certainly imply that. What did you make of the whole sorry tale? Oh, Siobhan's frozen. Okay, Julie, I'll ask you that question while we try to get Siobhan back.
I think that expression that was on Siobhan's face there kind of says it all about Matt Hancock, doesn't it? Yeah, do you know, I have to say, Maggie, when we were watching the football yesterday and my son said, oh, Hancock's gone, and we all said, there must be something else. There must be another story about to come out. Because it does seem to be, I think you're right, this euphemism, this broken social distancing for having an affair, it wouldn't normally bring bring any of these lovely Tories down, because sleaze doesn't seem to do it for them anymore. But I have to say, apart from laughing at did you see the video when the soundtrack had been the Alan Partridge?
I did.
Did, did you see that? I mean, quite funny and all that, but actually it's a very, very serious, it's a serious wrong he has committed to the people, to his office, and to his family. And I think falling on his sword gives him, actually, to say that he's done that, gives him a little bit more honour than I think he has. He's just a wee opportunist who's, got his pal in on the public purse, and so that he can conduct this horrible affair. And I'm glad he's gone, but I mean, goodness knows what's to
and his
come.
pal's brother has also benefited. We've definitely lost Siobhan completely, I'm afraid. His pal's brother has also benefited because he received some contracts under COVID. So the whole thing is back to this cronyism and sleaze. Yes, my view is that he should have been sacked rather than been allowed to resign. But obviously Johnson couldn't sack him for infidelity, because that would be hypocritical at the most awful kind. So I suppose we shouldn't really be surprised. But I'm wondering what's happened to Tory family values, because back in the day, having an affair would have been enough to get you out. But that seems to have gone. So have the Tories given up on family values then, Julie, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, and obviously this is just my opinion, Maggie, but it seems to me that we are the sort of drift away from. I've never been a fan of the Tories, but for the more acceptable Tories, if you say the One Nation family value Tories, we're now being run by basically the Eton sixth form common room, and I think they are just like, they're almost like children being allowed to do whatever they want. And as long as the voters stick with them, and the voting intentions are still absolutely horrifying, I have to say. As long as they stick with them, it doesn't matter what they do. So they can, it's rock and roll, in Downing Street, and they can do whatever they want, and they have, and they are.
But do you think Johnson's authority within the party has been damaged because he was prepared to stick by him? I mean, his attitude was nothing to see here, move on. And it's his own backbenchers, really. Because to be
Yeah.
fair, the opposition haven't really been anywhere on this. Keir Starmer hasn't really said very much. So do you think Johnson's authority might be damaged by this?
I suspect so, actually. And that was one of the first things that we said as well. Oh, I wonder who's coming in to replace him. And I don't think it's any, I think it's quite a strategic move to get Sajid back in the picture, because I think they view him as quite a dangerous entity on the backbenches, because he's not totally with everything that they've been doing. And I think it has, because I was reading that it's the real grassroots Tories that have said, you've got to get rid of him, mate. And he has bowed to it. So, yes, I hope his authority has been challenged.
Siobhan, it's not that I'm always looking for a conspiracy, but I kind of always am. Obviously, after Dominic Cummings' statements about Hancock, it was fairly clear that Hancock was going to be the fall guy for the government. And there are suggestions that the video that was leaked might have been hidden in a smoke detector. So I'm wondering whether actually there's been dark forces here. Do we see the hand of Cummings in this? Has he been set up? Not to say that he hasn't done what he's done, but has he been set up, and has it been deliberately linked, do you think, to get rid of him?
Yeah, I mean, same as you. I'm not one for conspiracy, but that was exactly what I was thinking. And it is an important issue, I think, as well, that if the health minister can be spied on in that respect, then it is quite concerning, because that leaves no bounds in terms of who is being spied on at that moment in time. Yes, I think that, given the constant drip, drip, drip against Matt Hancock, like you say, I think he deserves everything he gets. It's sleaze fighting with sleaze, isn't it, really? So, they're both kind of fighting amongst themselves, but it did look like a concerted effort to get rid of him. There seemed to be certainly kind of strategy behind that leaking. It reminded me a wee bit of the kind of Piggate incident, where there was that kind of move to get rid of Cameron, and then suddenly these stories abound. Doesn't make what they did any less wrong, but it certainly looks like the Tory party are subject to absolute increase in infighting, the likes of which we thought had calmed down a little bit when Boris Johnson came to power, but it's still bubbling there, not quite so underneath the surface anymore. So it really is. It's concerning, because these questions we need to ask how that information and how that footage came out, regardless of what we think of Matt Hancock, regardless of what we think of the Westminster government. This was a betrayal of kind of privacy, and it was leaked. So that needs to be considered. That needs to be thought out, and because it means that no one's safe from that level of interference, and by the looks of things, political machinations. It's all very Machiavellian, isn't it?
Well, it is very Machiavellian. It's the sort of thing you might expect in a banana republic, with a dictator, filming everyone round about him, gathering information to use against him should they turn against him. So yeah, I think it does have a really concerning strand underneath it. As for Sajid Javid coming back into the cabinet, well, how hypocritical of him. He stormed off in a huff. He wasn't going to be told who his aides could be, and he obviously fell victim of Cummings as well. He wasn't going to be told who his aides were going to be, and now he's delighted to be back in cabinet. I just hope he's checking his phones and his light fittings in case there's anything lurking there. So sadly, it would appear, because sleaze and corruption is now absolutely at the heart of government, it's plus ça change. Something that is also plus ça change, but is a lot more damaging, is the continuing concerns about abuse of women in political life. This week, the gentleman called Jonathan Bell, who was convicted of death threats and threatening behaviour towards Carol Monaghan, is waiting to be sentenced. So Carol is an SNP politician in Glasgow. She was subject to lots of abuse on Twitter and social media And then there were credible death threats issued against her by Bell, and she had to be moved to a safe house. And she was at serious concern for her family. We've had Carol on the programme in the past, and she's talked about being a victim of this abuse. It's utterly ridiculous, isn't it, Siobhan, that anyone in their work should be subject to this kind of abuse, and what needs to be done about this?
Yeah, it's it's a whole kind of Pandora's box, isn't it? This isn't in what in terms of what can be done. It's not even just people at work. It's just people generally online, kind of trying to have discussions, and so forth as well. There really is quite an insidious element that's kind of occurring across the board now, and the internet seems to be facilitating that quite a lot, actually. I was looking at the Scottish Government's report on cybercrime earlier on, and what was it, a third of MSPs have been sent death threats, and half of which are women. But sex crimes are increasingly on the rise across the internet. Something like 20% of all sex crimes reported were committed within the internet and within the social media structure, and that's increasingly younger women as well. So it really is quite an insidious kind of element to this. Threats are threats, and it has to be dealt with absolutely seriously. And I think there's a couple of things that we could probably do. I think the SNP needs to take the lead. I think they need to take some responsibility here. The Scottish Government are innovative, I think, in a lot of times where they can, in a lot of areas they're very innovative here. But I think that the SNP needs to take leadership by taking control within their own party as well, in terms of allegations of complaints, harassment, alleged, violence, and so forth. So there really is an element there that I think that SNP gets their own house in order to create an innovative mechanism for the rest of the country to try and deal with this as well. There is a racial undertone to all this stuff too. More kind of BAME communities are subject to racist attacks online, hate crimes online, and so forth. So we really have quite a significant one. I think it was the Alan Turing Institute said that 5% of white people had received hateful material, but 41% of black people had reported hateful material. So there's a massive racial disparity there as well. So it's a massive, massive complex mix. But I think there's also an element where we're sporadic in how we're reporting this. Social media report it very different ways, so there's no way of gathering that data and gathering that information. So it's a very, very complex case. We need to start taking it much more seriously.
But obviously it's not just affecting the SNP. So Kim Ledbetter, who is Joe Cox's sister, is standing in the by-election for Batley and Spence. Yes. And she has been subject to horrific abuse. And given what happened to her sister, this is really is extremely concerning. Yeah. And the implication, but what's happening as a result of this, though, is, Julie, is it's meaning that women don't want to stand for public office. It's turning women off. So I know that the deadline for women, for any application to be considered to be nominated for local councils for the SNP is not quite up. But last week, with just over a week to go, I think only 31% of applications were from women. Well, that's way short when they're trying to push for 50-50 representation. And things like this kind of sexualized abuse online, this backlash against women, women in positions of power are seen as a threat to some men. That's putting women off. They're worried about themselves, they're worried about their children. And so it has a real impact on democracy. So I'm wondering, does there need to be tougher legislation, Julie? I know that several women's organisations in Scotland are looking at taking this forward into sort of some campaigning. I know 50-50 are, I know Women for Indie are having a national council on this coming up quite soon. But we really need all political parties, do we not, to sign up to some kind of compact about this to say that they won't tolerate it and they'll take action. But I'm not seeing much cross-party chat about this. Julie?
No, and I think you're absolutely right, Maggie, that there does need to be, there needs to, and what Siobhan was saying is, as the SNP are in government, perhaps they need to take the initiative and take the lead on it. I mean, I received one of these that you're talking about, would you like to stand for council? And I had chats about that before, and I thought about it, and then I thought, no, I can't, I can't do that. And even I've had chats with my oldest son who would like to potentially go into politics, and he said, I don't know if I could cope with, the sort of abuse. And I said, well, if they couldn't find anything about you, they would find something about me, because it does seem that women in general are much more vulnerable to this abuse, and that's just endemic in society, I'm afraid. So I would relish a cross-party initiative for this, because I do think that we need women out there. I mean, we had that in our battle with our union with Equity that we're now all no longer members of, Maggie. And I could show you instances where women and men were treated very, very differently. And one woman in particular was basically hung out to dry, crucified for the behaviour of the men in the campaign. And it was so obvious that it was just, I'm going to home in this because she's a woman, and she's more vulnerable, and she was more and is more vulnerable. So therefore, all the women sort of, formed a defensive circle around her, and I stepped in and said, this will not do. But consequently, neither of us are members of the union anymore because they're sexist, But yes, a cross-party initiative, we need it.
And I think maybe some legislation. I don't think it's enough, is it, Siobhan, for Twitter to turn around and say, well, we've got guidelines and, we have rules, because they're clearly being flaunted. So is legislation
No,
the way
not.
forward?
Yeah, I mean, if it was a pub and there was constant aggression towards women within a pub, you wouldn't let the bar manager get away with saying, "Oh, well, but we do have rules." It's the same thing. It has similar impacts. Yeah, I think we do need tougher rules, and I think that there's a sense of individual responsibility here as well. That when we see it happening, we don't retweet it and go, "Oh my, isn't that terrible?" Coming from a very, very good place, but it can leave people feeling exposed and vulnerable. We report it. So that's what I've started doing. I don't retweet anything that I've seen. I just constantly report every abuse of and every kind of racist, misogynistic tweet that I see, on the basis that the more we report, the more we force these organisations into taking action. I'm just going to pick up on a point that that Julie was saying about women getting the blame. It struck me as well with the whole Andy Burnham incident that there was a gendered element to this here, that Nicola Sturgeon as a woman was getting the blame for something that she had no real responsibility for. There was a kind of male posturing going on there, which I found extremely distasteful, actually. And I quite liked Andy Burnham up to that point, but it struck me that there was an element of women in the verse, in the Nicola Sturgeon getting the blame for something that she had no responsibility over, that it was actually the responsibility of the UK government. And it was slightly distasteful. And I think when you've got politicians doing that publicly in order to kind of political point score, then that there's these smaller incidents that also have to be dealt with as well. But no, I think we do need legislation. I think we need tighter controls. We need to start reporting it much more. We need to start recording the incidents. The Alan Turing study said that it was very, very difficult to get a sense of what was happening because there's so many disparate ways of reporting it, and it's hard to get a sense of how real and deep-seated those incidents are occurring. So I think we do need to kind of start just treating it the way we treat any other crime or any other sense of harassment. Just because it's online, it doesn't make it any less serious.
No, and in some ways it makes it more serious because these people are
Yeah.
anonymous and you don't know who they are. And we know the instances of, rising suicide amongst young people who've been bullied online, both young boys and young women. And it really, but I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Siobhan. If there's no data or there's not reliable data, then it's easy to hide behind it and say it's not really an issue. So there's got to be some smart thinking about this. But the starting point would be, please, in Scotland, cross-party statement about this to stamp it out and to have something that causes common cause. Actually, finding common cause is one of the things that makes me really quite depressed. It seems there's very little that we can find in Scotland that isn't politicised to the nth degree. And the most recent one of that, again, involving women, is the recent announcement of the women who have suffered from not being included in the cervical smear campaign because they had partial hysterectomies. So, just so viewers understand, from 1997 and probably before, women who had partial hysterectomies were told they didn't need to be included in the cervical smear process. And as a result of the 434 women who that has affected since 1997, just, I think, 4 or 5 of these women have sadly died as a result. And this has come to light, and it's appalling. Now, this is not the fault of any politician as such. This is an error somewhere in the medical profession. But it has been politicised this week by the Liberal Democrats, Alec Holt-Hamilton and Jackie Baillie, who are saving pelters to the First Minister, despite the fact the earliest of the cases we know about were 1997, 2 years before devolution, and SNP didn't come into power till 2010. So why on earth, Siobhan, are they using this tragic incident, which again is women being badly treated and let down by the medical profession, to make a political point?
It's shocking, isn't it? And literally before the end of the last term of the Scottish Parliament, we saw that happening across the board over the Alex Salmond case, where women were used as tools to beat the Scottish Government over the head with. Not that the Scottish Government didn't perhaps, not that they didn't deserve some of that, but certainly the women didn't deserve to be dragged in. Women are not political pawns, and it's hard enough to kind of the families of the people that have died, to kind of for them to experience that was preventable. But to have them being used as political pawns, it's not right, and it's absolutely disgraceful behaviour. I think I'm thinking about the Nuffield Institute report on the NHS a few years ago, who were very complimentary of the Scottish NHS and said it was an inspiration for other countries to look at and so forth. But one of the points that they did make is that the politicisation of the NHS within Scotland was getting in the way of some of the tough decisions that the Scottish Parliament had to make. And this is a situation here where this is a Scottish problem. This is a health problem that we all have to take collective responsibility for. And it's like dealing with children. We have to deal with this in a grown-up situation. There was a terrible mistake made that led to the death of 5 women, okay? The only thing we can do now that we've discovered this is find a way forward and make sure that this never happens again. We're never going to get that done properly if we're constantly trying to political point scoring. It's unionism, actually, it is absolute crassest and absolute worst. I think it's quite abhorrent to use these cases as a means to try and undermine, because that's what's happening. It's been used to undermine the notion of independence and the SNP in particular. We need to come together, and this comes back to the lack of cross-party over abuse. It's the same thing. There's just no attempts to come together here, because it's so caught up in petty political struggles. And it's really sad to see. It's not the grown-up, modern, forward-thinking Parliament that I hope that we will push forward with.
The Parliament of all the talents that we were promised. You're right, it doesn't feel like that. And Julie, the Health Secretary said that there may be up to 500 extra cases that have stemmed from before 1997, and they're going to have to investigate that.
Yeah.
Now, surely to goodness, nobody can accuse the SNP of being to blame for something that happened before the Scottish Government came into power. But I suspect that they'll have a go. And I think Siobhan's point that women shouldn't be used as political pawns is absolutely essential. So what would your message be, Julie, to the opposition parties who are using this to make women political pawns?
Well, I want to pick up on what Siobhan was saying. They have to grow up, Maggie. Alex Cole-Hamilton is my MP, and he is a man who was caught on camera, as we know, saying off Margaret, and has never really been one for women's issues. So we know that potentially his heart is not in this, shall we say, and it is purely political point scoring. And I think that they have no right to use an incredibly emotive situation. You know, the health service is precious. We need to preserve it. We need to correct the wrongs. And that's not going to happen if people are just tearing it apart because they don't want independence. It seems to come down to that. It seems to just come down to that. And I think they just need to grow up. And how dare they use women? How dare they use anybody who's been affected by a medical, mistake, scandal, whatever you want to call it. But it is not grown up politics. And they're just bringing themselves down to the level of Westminster, if you ask me. So yeah, my message is grow up.
And I think obviously with COVID, as we're coming out of COVID, it'll be the fact that we're clearly in a third wave in terms of numbers. That's going to be even worse. But there's been a previous issue about women's health where there was a scandal and there was the same issues, was the issues of the transvaginal mesh implants that many women had. Women who were suffering from pelvic prolapse or stress incontinence were often given these mesh implants as a kind of catch-all. And it was proven that these were actually causing more problems than they were saving. And in 2018, they were banned and they can't be used now. A number of women have paid themselves to have those meshes removed, but the Scottish Government have just announced a fund that will reimburse any women who've had to pay for private surgery and will make sure that any woman who needs that mesh removed, it will be done on the NHS. So that's a good thing. But I suspect, Siobhan, we'll still see somehow this being an SNP bad story. Do you think?
I mean, what was the old joke that Nicola Sturgeon can, get the elixir of life, and the unionists would still cause, call it some kind of problem. And I think we have entered that territory in overdrive and on steroids now. It's not a Scottish problem, the mesh thing. It was Australia where it was first picked up, and in the US as well. It was a Johnson and Johnson thing by the looks of things. They've just, it was like 2 years ago, they just they settled out of court for an undisclosed sum with the Scottish women. But it's not a Scottish thing, it's an international thing. But that doesn't stop the blame and the nitpicking and as Julie said, the childishness of using these tragic cases and basically laying the blame on the SNP government's door. It's very depressing, isn't it? And I think that
and especially when you consider that Scotland is the only UK country to introduce this fund to help women who've suffered financially, and that point needs made fairly strenuously. So that's me making a strenuous point there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the test of a nation is that when we come across things like that, we come across traumas or errors that have been made, it's how we deal with them as we move forwards that is our biggest test, because we can't change the past. We can only change how we move forward from that. And I think it is a testimony to the Scottish Government that they've done this. It is a testimony to the opposition if they do try and undermine this and pick away at and blame the SNP.
Another test of a nation is if a nation can be compassionate and treat its people who live within its borders with dignity. And in that respect, we couldn't be more different from the way that the British Home Office treats asylum seekers. We're a year on from the stabbings at the Park Inn Hotel in Glasgow. These were asylum seekers who were moved from the houses that they were living in and put into hotels due to COVID, according to the Home Office. And the conditions in which they were living were appalling. And one asylum seeker who had mental health problems went on the rampage, stabbed several people, including a policeman, and he ended up being shot. And what it did was it threw up this fact that a lot of people weren't aware of, that asylum seekers were being housed in hotels rather than in houses, which is what the contract that the Mears Company have from the Home Office to house asylum seekers. The upshot of that is that Glasgow City Council, who is the only local authority at the moment to take general dispersal of asylum seekers in Scotland, has said because the housing situation is unacceptable, and clearly it's unacceptable to house people in hotels for any length of time, there's a ban now on taking more new asylum seekers into the city. That has its own problems, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But I'm just wondering, Julie, when this story broke a year ago, what was your immediate reaction?
To be honest, Maggie, I just immediately was heartbroken because I knew immediately it would be some poor soul with mental health issues, and that again, that in the same way that women's health has been politicised in the previous item that we were discussing, that would be politicised and it would be, oh, asylum seekers, bad, bad, bad. And, you know, the right wing press would try and obfuscate the things that we really need to look at with this, you know, that people cannot be kept in those kind of conditions and people have different needs. And everyone was just, oh, there's a pandemic, lump them in there. And that's going to be a powder keg. You know,
Yeah.
I'm surprised it wasn't a worse incident, but my heart bled. I just wept because I thought it's going to be blown out of all proportion and it's going to be asylum seekers bad, bad, bad. And, you know, it's going to be used for the Brexit cause. It's going to fuel racism. And, you know, I knew that nothing would really happen with it because we're still in a pandemic, but I'm glad that it's being marked today, that the anniversary has been marked. And I hope that, you know, we can take heed and try and sort things. But I know it comes straight from the Home Office, so you know the Scottish Government's hands are maybe a bit tied in this whole matter.
Refugees for Justice and Positive Action Housing, who've been particularly strong on the condemnation of the Home Office, made a statement, and they said that it was important people understood that the UK had a dysfunctional asylum system, and that its accommodation support dehumanises people, and it was reminding people that some of the people that come to Glasgow that seek asylum have been through appalling trauma in their own country. Some have been trafficked. Some of them are women who've been trafficked through the sex trade. They've had a horrific journey to get here, and to be dumped into a hotel, often without proper access to culturally appropriate food, fresh air, is unacceptable. But it's not the first time this has happened. Partly due to the housing shortage in Glasgow, a number of asylum seekers who, when they get their leave to remain, they have 28 days in which they have to quit the accommodation they've been given as asylum seeker and get into the accommodation system in Glasgow. For quite a long time, for about 2 to 3 years ago, 95% of asylum seekers who got leave to remain were being housed in hotels and homelessness accommodation. And the homelessness accommodation is still going on. The problem with the hotels was they'd nowhere to wash clothes. As I say, there wasn't culturally appropriate food for them to eat very often. And if they were coming to, I work with refugees in my day job, and if they were coming to training, they often had to leave the hotel before breakfast was available for them, so we were having to feed people. So the situation of not providing efficient, reasonable accommodation is not new. But Siobhan, I'm rather concerned that by Susan Aitken of Glasgow City Council saying, until this gets fixed, no more asylum seekers come to Glasgow, is playing into the hands of the Home Office, who don't have a particularly good relationship with Glasgow City Council, who have not appreciated the fact that Glaswegians have been very vociferous in their support for asylum seekers. I'm thinking about the Dawn Raid protests. I'm thinking about the Glasgow girls. I'm thinking about the support for the I family a few years ago. I think it suits the Home Office for Glasgow to say, we're not going to take asylum seekers anymore. They don't want a city which is fairly pro-asylum to be involved in their system. Do you think there could be something in that, Siobhan?
Yeah, I felt slightly uncomfortable with that decision, actually, if I'm honest. I felt that it was a bit of a kind of an easy decision. I don't mean, I'm sure that there was a lot of kind of emotional wrangling there, but it felt like the easy solution. So, you know, right, we're just not going to take vulnerable people anymore. And I get the rationale behind it, I do, but where do they go? It smacked a wee bit of not in my backyard syndrome, you know. So there was an element there, and I also take your point as well that Glasgow, we just need to look at what happened over the last few months. That Glasgow has been very, very staunch in its defence and rehumanising of asylum seekers and refugees, which is massively, massively important now. I think we could have handled that maybe a slightly better. We could have. I know it's a very, very difficult situation, but we can't just turn our backs on vulnerable people. And we need to find better ways of housing vulnerable people. We need to find better ways of dealing with their mental health and their trauma, because most people who are refugees and asylum seekers have experienced extraordinary trauma in getting here, even just the journey itself, let alone whatever they fled from. These people are vulnerable. We need to help them when in any way that we possibly can. So yes, it is a difficult situation, and I do think that we could have used maybe innovation here and forward thinking in order to resolve the crisis just a little bit better, I think.
Yes, I would have liked to have seen Glasgow City Council and the Scottish Government try to come up with another solution if at all possible.
Yes.
Because at the moment, dispersal to other parts of Scotland isn't happening. So it just means that asylum seekers are not coming to Scotland. And asylum
Yeah.
seekers in Scotland get a much better deal. They have access to English
Yeah.
language classes, for example, they don't have in England. So while I
Yeah.
absolutely agree people shouldn't be housed in hotels, I'm hoping that there can be some way forward that speaks well and speaks better for Glasgow.
Yeah, we have a moral responsibility to do this.
Well, on the subject of moral responsibility, then, Siobhan, what do you think about the moral responsibility of the US courts that have given Derek Chauvin 22 and a half years for the murder of George Floyd?
Yes, yes. I know that there's some disappointment. It wasn't long enough, but it does have to be, seen that it's the first kind of police sentencing, white police sentencing, because a black policeman has been sentenced before. So it is a big step forward, and I think that it was a fair one. It was a fair sentence, but it doesn't resolve the bigger issues. George Floyd may have received, or his family may have received, some closure here, but how many people have been killed by the police since then? I'm looking for the figure now. It's loads. It's over 1,000 since George Floyd have been killed by the police since then, across the US. So, the situation still continues, and black people are still 3 times likely to be shot by the police than their white counterparts. They're more likely to be killed than their white counterparts as well. So there's huge issues going on here that, yes, it's good that this man was sentenced. He deserved to be sentenced. That video just makes for horrific violence.
Well, yeah, I want to
George
speak
Floyd.
about that video because, Julie,
Yeah.
I think people forget that if it hadn't been for the bravery of the 18-year-old Darnella Fraser actually switching on her phone and videoing it because she was concerned, this might never have come to court. And I don't want to necessarily use the phrase citizen journalism. The producer of the show doesn't like that phrase. But, more and more, we are seeing people whipping out a camera or a phone and recording things. The police and any authoritarian group have to be aware that what they do now is no longer necessarily not going to be scrutinised. There doesn't need to be a TV crew there to record it. And I'm delighted to say that she's been awarded a special Pulitzer Prize. So what did you make of her doing? I mean, she was demonised by the defence. They tried to make out that she'd doctored it and all sorts, and that she was trying to stir things up. And, she was really put through the mill when she was in court. But I think it's important, isn't it, Julie, that we appreciate now. So what's the impact of the fact that things like that can be recorded by anybody?
I think it's a massive impact, and I'm surprised that the American police, you can take it 2 ways. You can say that the guy absolutely knew it could have been recorded, but he didn't care because he was going to do what he was going to do, and as he saw it, the execution of his duties. But I think it's incredibly important. I know we were talking previously about online things and people having too much of an opportunity to get to people. But this is, in my opinion, this is a sort of a force for good. And how incredibly brave of that young woman to just whip out the phone. I mean, she must have been traumatized by what she saw, but she must have, in somewhere inside her, knew how important it was. I have to say, I absolutely balked at his mother saying, I completely believe in your innocence and I will be here for you when you get out. Siobhan's mother said that. And how can you have that opinion when you have seen that video? Even if it's your own son. Yes, stand by them, but do not say you're innocent and you didn't do it. Um, Maggie, I remember us talking about this, saying when the verdict was due, and we were saying, what do you think? And we both said it was unlikely that it would be guilty. So I think it's a really positive thing that it was guilty. And I think it's a start. Like Siobhan was saying, it's not enough. It's not addressing everything, but I think it's fair sentence actually, but it doesn't rewrite history. And actually, the only true justice for George Floyd would be if he hadn't been killed. But it is a start, and I hope that it continues. I hope the momentum keeps going. And please God, I hope that the police officers realise that everyone's going to be filming them now. So if that's the only thing that keeps the behaviour in
Well,
check, then
the other police officers who were with them are still away, are still got charges to face
yeah.
on, I think it's racially aggravated behaviour, and will be interesting to see what happens there, because that's saying the buck doesn't stop with the person who knelt on the neck, that they were also complicit. It's interesting that Chauvin has expressed his condolences to the family, but he has not apologised, which would suggest, Siobhan, that he's not accepting his guilt, that he's just deciding he's not guilty. So it's unlikely, I think, that sentence will be cut short. I would assume. I don't know enough about the American legal system to know whether that's even possible. But what would be one of the things that worries me slightly about the video and this everybody wanting to film something is, if that starts to become something that the police find difficult, then that's when authorities start to crack down on it and start saying you can't film things. So the worrying thing would be that actually filming the police in the future becomes illegal. Do you think that's likely to happen, Siobhan?
Anything is possible, isn't it? And we've also got, and I think that it is in part a result of the kind of the media culture that shows society in a much more unmediated way. We've got a destabilization between what's real and what's not. That's coming, that came from the right within America as well. So there's a sense of kind of, we don't believe what we see before our very eyes. So that kind of destabilization, I think, undermines some of that film evidence. I think there was a case a few years ago where it was also filmed, and the defense just completely undermined it and unpicked it, trying to get the jury to see that what they see, it wasn't really what they saw. So there's that kind of cultural undermining happening at the moment, I think, anyway, that what we see is really not what we see, and we've been told that quite a lot. So there is that kind of move, I think, towards that sense of protection of the police and the institutionalised structures, that we're not sufficient witnesses, even though we're filming it, so there is an element of that. If you look at America, white power always finds ways to keep the power. That's what's happened since America started in 1605 and the first people settled there. It's always a means to create their own power and protect their own power. Even after slavery ended, the Ku Klux Klan started, and it was one of the most violent periods in American history, with the Ku Klux Klan marching through the towns, 4 million of them at one point, lynching, terrorising, castrating, so we've really got a long history of white America trying to sustain their white power. If that retains their power, I think there's nothing that they won't do, and certain institutions, nothing that they won't do. I think the fact that the guy still is not admitting his guilt is symptomatic, I think, of a police force that's fundamentally based on kind of racism, and that's a really depressing thing to say. Maybe slightly hyperbolic, but I do think that there is an element there. If we look at the police activity within the US, it is violent and it is racist against the black communities. Black communities are terrified of the police in certain areas.
Yeah, and the police,
there's not with the realms of possibility.
the police in the States seem to have quite a lot of power because it's a very fractured, fragmented system, and I think
Yeah.
individual police forces obviously operate differently. I think individual sheriffs operate differently. There does seem to be quite a lot of power. But closer to home, we can't forget that the British government have passed or are in the process of passing legislation which means members of the armed forces will be exempt from prosecution for abuses of human rights. So that desire to protect the agents, if you like, of authoritarian government is beginning to start in the UK. So I think we need to watch this space. On a completely different theme, we hear a lot about the damage to the hospitality industry and tourism because of COVID and Brexit. But actually, the real people who have suffered throughout of this, who've had very little support or meaningful support from the British government, are the arts. All aspects of the art, theatre, music, touring, all of that. So, Julie, this is your area. Just give us a snapshot of the sorts of problems that people working in the arts have had to face for the last 15 or 16 months.
Well, where do I even start? I mean, our industry was obliterated overnight. Because everything just closed down, and with everything, I mean, across the board closing down, lots of people's side hustles closed. People who work in little cafes, work in bookshops, all that sort of thing. So the source of income was just, non-existent. And then little hardship funds came in, and I have my own issues with them, Maggie, because I felt that they were means tested, and they were sort of, you were having to really justify your existence to people like, some quite high profile people got themselves involved in hardship funds. And I thought, it really, really sticks in my craw having to go to this person and say, this is how much I have in my bank account. Can I please have £500? Or so you saw people just thinking, what on earth am I going to do? I've done this, like if you're me, you're in your 50s, and you're thinking, what? I've done this for 30 years. What can I do? People trying to get delivery jobs, and it just, some people got paid out on gigs that got cancelled, but it depended on what sort of contract you were on. People who work in commercial theatre, nothing. The West End, they got a one-off payment. That was it. It wasn't a huge amount. So any kind of help from the government was, gratefully received. But you're talking about that whole 80% of your profits for the last 3 years. Well, people in my business don't have a lot of profits. So, I recently, as the green shoots are starting to come through, I was talking to my agent, and she said, oh, I've got clients who've just given up. They can't come back. There's just no way. A producer I work with very closely is living on a COVID loan. So we're not all in the realms of Andrew Lloyd Webber, who had talked about COVID proofing his theatre, or is going to sue the government and all this kind of thing. But the long and short of it is, Maggie, if the theatres don't open back up at capacity, they cannot survive, and no amount of government bailout is going to save them. It just will not happen. It's a business that's predicated on bums on seats, and we need to get people back into that theatre. We need to build up their confidence and get them back in. Hopefully, at post August the 9th, that is going to happen. And there have been these pilot test events and all that, and I think the results have been very good. Actually, 28 cases of COVID from all these things from 58,000 people. But it's an industry that I think is going to not be recognisable for a long time to come. And even all the dramas and things that are being made, that they're all different because it's all social distancing. We really need to not be socially distanced.
But you talk about the green shoots, but just as those green shoots are sticking their head up, they're going to get a second whammy with Brexit, because of course the
Yes.
impact on touring and being able to tour to Europe has been, the rug's been taken out from under them. Elton John's been pretty vociferous on this just this week. In fact, just today, I think he's furious with the government, and he says, fine for him. He's got a lot of money, but he's, for individual musicians, and he's talking about mostly musicians, there's just nowhere else for them to go. So what do you think what's the impact of Brexit going to be on top of COVID?
Well, that was what we were worried about before.
Sorry,
We were all worried about Brexit. We were all
you're
saying, and we have a general secretary, not anymore because I'm not a member of Equity anymore, but the Equity General Secretary was not just a Brexiteer, but campaigned for Brexit, which I can't, it just makes my head do a 360. I cannot understand that because it's the massive implications in our business. Because there's a lot of touring that happens, not just music. There's a lot of touring that happens, theatre shows, and but I've got a really good friend who's a musician, and he is just beside himself. In his career up until now, he's worked everywhere, absolutely everywhere, and it's not Coldplay, it's not the Rolling Stones, it's not Elton John that are going to suffer. They can afford to buy the licenses, the visas for every country that they go into when they're touring, for every member of that company. But it's the grassroots, dare I say it. And Elton John, I mean, I find Elton John hilarious, I have to say. It's a bit of a figure of fun in this house. But I have to say, go the wee man in this one, because he is saying you're going to miss out on a generation of musicians because they're not going to be able to get that fantastic experience. And I don't know where they go, because you can't do it. And in Britain, it's too small. You can't build up that fan base. And actually, the entertainment industry is our, I think, superpower. You know, international superpower. Everybody loves British music, and everybody loves the theatre. So,
Well, from a purely
go Elton.
economic position, when they talk about the billions that the entertainment industry brings into the economy, to be fair, a lot of that is predicated around London's West End. It's not as wealthy in other parts of the country. But Siobhan, you'd think that would be enough to make the government think this is a strand of income that, you know, we're going to suffer with a loss of income. But Elton John has said today that the government are Philistines. Is that what's at the heart of it? They just don't care about the arts. They're prepared to sacrifice the arts.
Yeah, I mean, slightly cutting out a wee bit, but yes, and I think that I've been thinking about this just quite recently, because I think the role of art is often underestimated, is often seen as something that's marginal to society, but art is absolutely central to how a society thinks about itself, how a society articulates its hopes, its ideas, its fears, its understanding. If you look at the role of art in history, it's often there with political revolutions and so forth, because it's so important in helping people understand and articulate what's happening in the world that we often don't understand. So if you look at the role of COVID and the trauma and the decades that it'll take us to process what we've all experienced as individuals and as collective, art is absolutely, for me, absolutely central to help us move forward as a society and try and articulate those difficult paths that we've been experiencing over the last 18 months especially. Art has never been more central in our recovery, I think. And I think it's to grossly underestimate the importance of that is to actually refuse us a voice as a society, because it's not just about the artist given expression. It often helps the rest of society articulate, understand, get a sense of perspective through that art that's been promoted across Scotland and across the globe, for that matter. It is absolutely central, I think, to our recovery. I mean, art gets used as therapy for very obvious reasons. To see it as a marginal one is so short-sighted and so misunderstands the role of art.
Maybe you've hit it. That's the problem, because the arts, and the theatre in particular, can be a mirror that is held up to government to reflect what they're doing. Maybe they see it as a threat. I joked at the beginning about the carry on up the cabinet, but you know, I'd put money into that. If somebody wants to write a show, let's make it a musical. We're going to end on an arts related story, which also links very nicely back into the theme of today about women's voices being silenced. And that is the extraordinary case of Britney Spears, who appeared by phone at a Los Angeles court this week to criticise in the strongest terms the conservatorship that she's been subject to 13 years. She outlined in detail some of the things that she's not been allowed to do, and it really is Gilead Max, I think. Julie, have you been following the Britney Spears story?
I have a bit actually, and it's horrific. I mean, basically, it's slavery, isn't it? They're protecting their commodity with not a care for that poor girl's mental health or well-being, and it's just it's so mean and uncaring, and especially when you think that one of the people who's the main player in it is her father, and that's who's supposed to look after her. Um, I hope she gets the decision. She's going to have to prove that she is able to make her own decisions. But I hope they rule in her favour, because I think she's basically been held in slavery.
I think the thing that struck me, Siobhan, was when she said she admitted that she's been telling people for years that everything's fine and there were no problems. That is the anthem of abused women across the world, isn't it? You just say everything's fine, you
Yeah.
don't want to make a fuss. And it is abuse. There's no other. And the sexualization of her as a performer, if you look at when, partly when she started out as quite a young girl, she had this gutsy, soul-driven voice, quite a deep voice. And then suddenly we got the breathy Britney in the mini skirt, the good girl, daddy's girl sort of thing. And people even commented when she spoke in court how her voice was different. That it was much deeper and it almost didn't sound like Britney Spears because she's maybe actually found her voice. So what's your take on the whole thing, Siobhan?
Yeah, poor Brittany. I mean, I do. I watched a documentary. It must have been about 6 months ago now, and it was basically some of Brittany's fans demanding that the conservatorship, I can never say that word, the conservatorship ends. So they were kind of fighting on her behalf, which was actually really quite interesting, and it sounded really quite horrific. Even control over Brittany's reproduction is something that's at play here. I mean, it's a terrible, and it is slavery. Julie, that was the word that I was thinking as well when I was looking into this case again and revisiting it. And this is it hits on a very, very dark history of enforced sterilizations and enforced control over women's reproductive rights. I mean, ICE were said to be doing it to immigrant women as late as 2010. So it kind of hits on a very dark history. Brittany's a kind of a strange case because on first instance she looks very privileged, but actually there's a real darkness behind her story. God that she gets the freedom that she wants. I hope every woman does, and I hope she does uses her experience to protect other women.
And if the fact that she is, wealthy and does appear privileged is a real concern, because if a woman in that position can be so controlled, what help and hope is there for women who are not in such a strong position, who have people fighting for her? And I can remember that documentary too, and there was a real sense after it that the fans were all mad and nuts, partly because she was saying there was nothing wrong and that it was some kind of conspiracy, and it's been proven right. But the control of women's bodies is a battle that women are still fighting. And the reason I mentioned Gilead, if you remember from The Handmaid's Tale, one of the first things that changes in that society is when women are no longer allowed to get birth control unless their husbands or male partners sign the piece of paper to say that they've approved it. And it just sent a shiver down my spine. She's not allowed to go in the car with her boyfriend. And it's utterly horrific. So it's been a bit of a theme of today, the silencing of women, especially women in power and women who are in the public eye, as well as women who are not as visible. It's a battle I think we're going to be fighting for a long time. So thank you both for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed the programme at home, or if you're watching it on catch up. We always make the plea that we need money and continual resources to keep Good Ship Broadcasting Scotland going. We have a tremendous facility here in Glasgow. We're just about to get our outside broadcast van kitted out so we can travel around the country and deliver more exciting programmes for you. But it can't be done on air. So if you've enjoyed today, if you think Broadcasting Scotland is worth supporting, then please go onto the website, have a look at what we do and make a donation or a pledge to continue supporting us. www.broadcastingscotland.scot. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you both today, and I had forgotten, Julie, that yes, we were on together when we were discussing the George Floyd case, and we were pretty despondent and didn't think it was going to come good. So maybe there is hope. Let's hope so. Once again, everyone, enjoy your Sunday. Good afternoon.